I am always very excited to speak in Bangalore because the audience in Bangalore brings a lot of energy. And being a techie, like I love to talk about technology more than I love to talk about business. And in Bangalore, like there is a lot of connect with the technology audience. So how many of you are techies over here? Like people who write software? Majority of you? Great, awesome, awesome. So I'll talk about our journey as E2E Networks began in 2009, and the original impetus for doing E2E Networks was that uh, like there was no contractless computing available in India. So the impetus was that like there was no contractless computing available in India in 2009, and practically we were the only player who was even thinking about doing compute based out of India. So everyone used to use the compute out of India in US or Germany or other countries. So that was the environment. So when we first thought about like, okay, we are going to run like a cloud kind of a system over here, we started writing Perl scripts in a dungeon, metaphorically speaking. Like this is how we do everything, like orchestration, provisioning, monitoring, billing, etc. And then when we went to the market, we did a tour of the incubators around Delhi NCR, and one of the first customers we met told us that yeah, there is definitely a need for this. You guys should be definitely doing this, but the problem is that nobody buys cloud in India. So everyone in India buys dedicated servers. So then we kind of like junked all the code we had written, and we said, okay, fine. So we are a dedicated server company, and we became a virtual private server and dedicated server company. So that was the kind of like origin of E2E. So then as our journey went on, so then cloud started becoming more popular. So kind of like we anyway were like, all of us were like old hands at open source technology. So some of you who might have attended like the old uh, Linux Asia or Linux Bangalore kind of events, like would have met some of our team members who may not have been part of E2E networks at that time. So mostly our team consists of all the old hands at open source technologies. And what we have built today in 2018 over the last couple of years is that we have used Open Nebula, which is a competitor of OpenStack, to build up our cloud platform, and then we have built features loosely coupled on top of that, and we'll talk about like what we did during the 9-year journey. And thanks to open source, like we have been able to create the most cost effective cloud platform in India, uh, which is completely not dependent on any US dollar components at all, except for the hardware. So there is no proprietary license used anywhere in our stack that leads us away from our control of our own destiny. So like again today, like we have more than 1,000 customers. Uh, uh, from the solutioning perspective, we have solved like uh, kind of like more than 50,000 problems on various parts of open source stack. So for example, like top 100 problems on Apache Web Server, top 100 problems on Nginx, top 100 problems on MySQL, top 100 problems on MariaDB, top 100 problems on load balancing using HA proxy. So we have done it all. So there is no part of open source stack which our team has not worked on, and on which our team has not gained experience on. So kind of like we have worked on every part of the open source stacks. So we kind of like support the entire gamut of things that people use, from TensorFlow to normal LAMP web servers. So like our team has experience on everything. So cumulatively our DevOps team has more than 100 plus years of experience on mainly how to manage open source infrastructure. So let's talk about E2Es, like essentially the 5 E's of our open source journey. So, so like I said, like in 2009, we were like a dedicated server company. So then when we had to do our first VPS server platform, so how we were doing it was like our own homegrown Perl scripts, sometimes bash scripts, and kind of like inside the machines we were using virtual min for setting up the LAMP stack, again using the Perl scripts we wrote, and we were using the open source version of Zen, not the licensed version, which is now free license, but I'm not sure whether it is fully open source. But open source, then our definition was that it runs on CentOS and it runs from public repositories and all the source code is available. So we were using that to set up our VPS servers, and it used to be a very manual process. So the natural evolution was that we wanted to look for a open source stack on which to run our VPS platform, through which we could hook up our billing systems. So one of the first softwares that came to our mind by anyway having the virtual min background was that we could use CloudMin, which was again written by the same author as virtual min, and we initially started with the fully open source version. Rather, all of it is open source, but there were limitations in terms of support for number of machines in the open source version, and the commercial version was also completely open sourced, but you needed to buy the license for that. So again, the Red Hat model. So kind of like philosophically that fit in with what we were trying to do, where we said that okay, we are able to know from the software by reading the software what does the software do. We can audit the software and figure out like it's not doing an unintended action. We have the ability to debug the software at a code level if required. So we purchased the license for CloudMin and ran our VPS platform on top of that. So that continued for like some time of our journey. So but as you can see, like we were evolving into an open source shop, where open source was a part of our DNA, where we would be very wary of using anything which was not open source as a part of our core infrastructure. So next we tried to join the movement in terms of like where people started building OpenStack. There was Eucalyptus, another cloud orchestration layer. Then there was Anomaly, there was OpenNebula. So we evaluated all 4 of them, and we decided to go with OpenNebula. Now our goal was always that okay, if there are missing parts in OpenNebula, we will go and contribute to open source. Now unfortunately in practice, what happened was that we very rapidly overwrote parts of OpenNebula, built our first prototype of the cloud, where you could launch the machines, use an API to launch the machines, and do automated billing, generate invoices, and everything that a modern cloud system is supposed to do. But our fork continued to remain proprietary for far too long, for kind of like lack of that being contributed back to the main line of open source. So then what we found was that like this product is actually much farther behind in terms of technology than the actual open source, which had progressed much further. So then we canned the whole project after working on it for 2.5 years, and we said like okay, let's migrate all the cloud customers back to VPS, and kind of like go back to the drawing board and write a cloud which actually extends open source software in a loosely coupled fashion, so that you are always able to go back to the main line of open source code, and you never get kicked off the new developments that are happening in open source. So now today the philosophy of course is that do any kind of open source in a loosely coupled fashion with any kind of proprietary code. That part of the proprietary code is proprietary simply because nobody else needs it. So the billing we do for our cloud is very custom specific to someone like E2E Networks, but not very useful for anyone else who is trying to operate their own cloud, whether it is a private cloud or their own public cloud, because it's very, that logic is very tightly coupled to what we do. So we didn't see much of an advantage in open sourcing those parts of the code. But definitely there is a philosophy that, like, as and when we find something that we are able to do faster than the main line of open source, we would contribute that back to open source. And in fact, we are trying to figure out like how to use our CSR budget in a tax compliant way to contribute back to Open Nebula and any open source that we generally use. And also we are very open to doing bug bounties kind of programs for people who contribute to open source. So we have an internal list of things that we want to contribute to open source, and we would be very happy to work with any open source developers who are also working on the same softwares and are looking for commercial support in terms of, like, so everyone needs to pay bills. So we are very happy to support any open source developers who work on the same software and are based in India. So those are the only two criteria we have. So definitely our idea is to extend our usage of open source in a way that meshes well with the philosophy of open source without doing any proprietary forks, which are also commercially like a very bad decision. So anytime you are using open source and you fork it and you have your own proprietary fork, like, you no longer have the benefit of taking up all the contributions from everywhere in the world onto that open source. So, so that was the early lesson we learned in our journey, and that has stayed with us, that there is no competitive advantage of forking an open source software into a proprietary fork, which is not able to keep up with the main line of code. So today, of course, like, thanks to our control of destiny by using loosely coupled open source software, so we have a pure solid state disk based cloud platform based in India, which has the best price performance ratio. And thanks to the fact that we don't use any proprietary licensing as a part of our cost structure, we are completely in control of our destiny. So much so that, like, our profitability led us to list on the National Stock Exchange SME platform. And kind of like we can say that, like, thanks to open source and being very kind of like closely enmeshed into it, has allowed us to kind of like take this journey from a bootstrapped startup, then a funded startup to, so we only took seed money of about $500,000 and on to like a public stock exchange. Also, of course, it's at a small level compared to like some of the bigger IPOs we hear about, but it's a validation of the fact that there is so much value to be derived from open source that like a very small bunch of techies can go from a bootstrapped small startup where you are doing your own racking stacking of servers physically to the stock exchange. So of course, like, I am sure, like, through all the talks through the day, we have been talking about like all these advantages of open source. So no point of me repeating those advantages. So we have utilized like every single advantage that open source brings to the table. So of course, the software is all available, and software's quality is very high, because there are too many eyes watching over the bugs in the software or watching over the logic and the algorithms of the software for open source to be bad. And of course, if open source is bad, obviously it doesn't work. So essentially, open source is a meritocracy compared to sometimes poor quality code in proprietary world can continue to have a life of its own, because people are tied into licenses, it needs to be continued to be supported. So in a proprietary world, like a developer who is getting paid is working for the salary. In open source world, the developer is working for the love of the quality of the code and the change and the functionality it is bringing to the world. So that's the difference between open source and proprietary software. And due to this reason alone, like open source is usually of better quality than proprietary code, because people love to do what they are doing, and when people love what they are doing, then obviously they do a better job of that. So now, having embraced this approach of open source, so what we are looking at this approach is also how do we extend this approach to the cloud. So what we believe is that like cloud native in a proprietary format is again a very similar kind of mistake that people were making with proprietary software. So essentially, what we are trying to do today is like figure out which are the drop-in replacements of open source that can replace proprietary microservices which are fully locked and not available to the end consumers on a public cloud. So they should be made available in a way that the administrative access of those microservices is available with the end users, and they are truly able to appreciate and use the full power of open source in those microservices, rather than relying on a proprietary large software public cloud to deliver those microservices for you in a fairly proprietary fashion. So kind of like one of our major parts of our business today in the DevOps and CloudOps world has been to identify and work on open source orchestration of softwares which can replace the proprietary parts of public cloud platforms and make them available on any cloud which is providing raw compute globally anywhere in the world. So the simple idea is that like people who want to continue to use cloud native services, they can limit that cloud native services which are very proprietary in nature to about 20% of their cloud bills, and using E2E's platform, they should be able to use open source microservices to deliver the services to their customers without getting locked onto the proprietariness of any of the public cloud platforms for major part. So in that, our strategy is that like wherever you can use open source as drop-in replacement for cloud native services, replace them. Some places where you probably need to re-architect, for example, an example would be HA proxy plus Redis can replace the queue management services that proprietary clouds provide. So re-architect to use open source, which is still more or less drop-in replacement where you don't need to change your code. And third is like if you are unable to replace anything, then the internet today has become like a low latency place. So simply continue to use parts of cloud native proprietary software by accessing it from places where you have raw machines where you are using open source microservices and access them over there. But this transformation strategy going towards open source still ensures that you are able to do 80% of your cloud bills using open source software. So that's what we are doing today in our as a part of our multi-cloud cloud transformation growth strategy. So where we are saying that like not only will we convert 80% of your cloud bill to open source, but we will also save 44% of your costs by using open source. And this we promise on any public cloud anywhere in the world. So essentially, we want to empower all cloud users with the same kind of freedom that we have experienced by empowering them both financially, freeing them up from what you call the tyranny of opaque proprietary billing that you don't even understand. So for example, in load balancing services of most public clouds, you get billed on 5 different variables, certain combination of 5 different variables. So that's as proprietary a licensing as it can get. It reminds you of a certain proprietary database company whose licensing most people in the world did not understand. So that's the kind of proprietariness the cloud is getting to today. So you need platforms that can make you cloud agnostic, and those cloud agnostic platforms can only be built on top of open source. So again, I'm sure like this is not very super relevant to a tech audience, but we've kind of like grown like hundreds of percentage points since we began our journey. So to recap, like we evolved from an open source world, then we extended open source in ways which was not very nice to ourselves commercially, and then we kind of like changed our strategy and extended open source by embracing the philosophy of open source, including the underlying philosophy. And with the help of that, we were able to economize to an extent our entire stack, that we were in control of our destiny, that led us to the IPO. And today we want to bring the same empowerment to our customers. So happy to kind of like take up any questions around this. Yeah, please. Sure. So we are 1/3 the cost of AWS.
Okay, that's very good to know.
Sure.
And the second follow-up question I had, like,
so why mostly all of the private cloud operators were very expensive was because they were using proprietary hypervisors, where they had to either pay on a per GB of RAM some license cost per month, or they had to pay on a per processor, or even per core.
Okay, got it. So another thing was like you have your own data centers, like in terms of redundancy and fault tolerance and all those things.
So data centers today in India, like tier 3 plus or tier 4 data centers. So like a lot of these players do that. So Entity NetMagic does tier 3 plus data centers, which are of very high quality. And similarly, Control S does tier 4 data centers, and I think there are a bunch of other players who are doing that. So we are not a physical data center company as such, but we use one of these two or 3 or 4 players as a backend, where we buy power, rack space, and bandwidth from these operators. And on top of this, our compute platform runs and is accessible to the end users.
Okay, thank you.
In fact, congratulations, fantastic run company. I've been associated, knowing you for years now, because
Thank you.
2004 way back we were all there.
Cool.
And what I would like to mention is freedom of choice is what open source gives us.
Absolutely.
In addition to freedom of money, what otherwise is why open source is taken for. The choice of freedom is more important than the other kind of freedom that open source gives.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Congrats, Tarun.
Thank you.
Any advice you'll give, like a budding open source tool, how to kind of accomplish what your team, your company has?
So you're talking about open source entrepreneurs, or you're talking about open source developers?
Open source entrepreneurs.
Cool, cool, cool. So there are like a bunch of models for open source entrepreneurs. So there are obviously some very, very successful companies like Red Hat. Then there have been other successful companies like Gluster FSF. Then there are companies who are doing hybridized models. So people like Redis, for example, they are both doing open source software as well as doing open source based cloud microservices, replacing the proprietary services over there. So the advice for entrepreneurs is less related to open source, but more related to product market fit. So typically you will find that customers are usually not as passionate as us in the community about the freedom of the code and all those things, but they do understand the business parts of it. So the business part of like not having open source code, I'll give you an example. So I used to love playing a few games which are not open source, right? So they were all rage during 1999, 2000, 2001, those kind of time frames. Now the operating systems that those games were run on, those operating systems are no longer available. Those versions are no longer available. I have the latest operating systems definitely available on laptops and everything, but those games won't run on those. So in the self-interest of people whom you are trying to sell open source, so that is one advantage you can explain to them, that like given access to source code, like even if I as a small vendor to you ceases to exist, you will still have access to the source code and you will still have the possibility of being able to continue to run your business. So that being said, for entrepreneurship, the only advice is that you need to find something to do which is working for in a large marketplace. So which means that like when you try to sell something, like make sure that there is a large market for that. And second is that you need to have a product which solves a real problem. Now to build that product, you can use open source as moving parts of it. You can make the entire product open source if you are distributing that as a software. Uh, but that being said, like the product market fit is very important. So if there is no product market fit, nobody is going to buy it. So your success as an entrepreneur is assured by 2-3 things. Number one is that you are operating in a large market. Number two, you have a product market fit. And number three, at all times, you are in control of your destiny. So an open source entrepreneur in control of their own destiny, working in a market where they have a product market fit and the market is large enough, like that was the winning formula for us. And I do seem to think that like that would be a winning formula for any entrepreneur.
Sir, actually, we are planning to venture a company regarding augmented reality.
Sure.
So, when does Oculus Reef come to Indian market? So that.
I have no idea. Sorry.
Okay, sir.
But if Oculus Reef is not there, like I'm pretty sure that like you will find enough open source hackers in Bangalore who can figure out like how to build devices on small form factor on Raspberry Pi or similar kind of platforms that can do, or Android, which can deliver Oculus type of experience to your customers.
Okay, thank you.
So you should never worry about like, are you worried about them as a competitor?
Yes.
So never worry about competition.
Yes, sir.
So what you need to worry about is like, are you building something that your customers need, and then keep hacking on like how to improve the user experience of your customers. So it doesn't matter. So I mean like through our journey we have seen like so many competitors arrived in India one by one, but that doesn't really matter. Like your focus should not be on competition. Your focus should be on what you are able to deliver in terms of value to your customers.
Thank you, sir.
The cost factor that we have in this, is it very relevant only in the Indian markets? Or
No, it's relevant everywhere.
so,
So I mean, in today's world, like essentially, okay, the quantitative easing eventually will be over. So access to very cheap money, large amounts of money, like that era would go through a cycle where like that is no longer there. So eventually, people will have to ensure that like their unit economics is going somewhere. So which is why like cost factor is important for anyone trying to do anything in the world. So like I'll give you a simple example, like you are bidding for a smart city project. Your cost of facial recognition, if it is 1/3 of competitor, you will definitely be able to win against that competitor, all other factors being the same. So I don't think that cost differentiation matters at a level of 10-15%, but at a level of 50%, 60%, anywhere in the world cost difference will make a difference.
okay, thank you.
So shall we like, if there are no other questions, we can end the talk. Cool. So yeah, please. Sure, sure. Not yet, unfortunately, but we'll put it up soon. So more like less of bug bounty, but more of like feature addition.
Feature addition.
Yeah. So bug bounty mostly is around centered around security flaws. So not just security flaws, but like also around like how to extend the open source that we use. So the features that we need, or features that maybe developers think are cool, open source developers think are cool. So we are happy to fund at least some of those features.
I think you might have missed the GitHub. Yeah. It would be great if you had put the GitHub.
We
link
will do
also.
that. We'll do that. We'll do that. We'll do that. So again, we are a work in progress.
Okay.
So philosophically, we are all there. But then in practice, like when developers want to put out their code, they want to ensure that it is something that people will respect them for. So it is very, very hard to convince a dev team that like, no, today you need to put it on GitHub. So the answer would be like, look, like there are still internal password credentials that are still a part of the code somewhere or the other. So we can't simply put it out on the GitHub today. Then second part is that like I can't lose respect from my peers and fellows by putting up like this kind of shitty code. So I need to improve this and then I'll put it up. So kind of like those kind of challenges are still there even with the management philosophy that like we need to be an open source company, we need to contribute out to the community and so on. So even with those like things unfortunately take more time than a typical Silicon Valley company, which is kind of like working with top talent. So, so those are some of the limitations of working in India in a non-Bangalore environment. So thank you all of you. Like really appreciate you guys sitting through all the talks through the day and kind of like bearing with me for like more than 35 minutes. So thank you everyone.